Hey, so I want to talk about Banjo Tooie specifically, and I wanted to talk about the buildings that are built in this game that have specific shapes. And there are two buildings that I'm interested in at the moment. One is the round building known as the Colosseum. The Colosseum is a round shape, a round building. And this round shape then exists sort of as contrasted with, in my mind, another building, which is the Atlantis buildings. The Atlantis buildings are a they are a different type of building, you could say, because they're square. They're Greek also. They emulate ancient Greek architecture. So I was talking about the two buildings in Banjo-Tooie that have specific shapes. There's a round building, the Colosseum, in Hailfire Peaks. You can also access it from Mayhem Temple, I think. And it's a round building, therefore it is contrasted somehow to the square building in Atlantis. The buildings in Atlantis are square. And these buildings, we've got one which is round, one which is square. And I think what ties them together is that one is a sort of Greek building, the other is a Roman building. So one is a Roman Colosseum, the Colosseum as a building, like an ancient architectural style, right? The Roman Colosseum, and it's round and it's ancient, and it is also, you could say, decrepit, broken, right? There are ruins here and there. Next to the Colosseum in Banjo-Tooie, there are bits of rock fallen down, like parts of the architecture have collapsed, and I think you can see columns also collapsed onto the lava. So it's an ancient building. It belongs to like a world from the past, a world that's gone by, right? It's architecture from the past, and here it is, right? And then Atlantis evokes Greek, ancient Greek architecture, also an ancient sort of architecture from a world that isn't here anymore. I mean that even in game, Atlantis is presented as a ruin. Again, the buildings are collapsed. Many of the columns have fallen. I mean, some of it is intact completely, but it is in some sense, collapsed, broken, decrepit, old, from the past. Right, to begin with, it is sunk underwater, so it doesn't really exist anymore at some level as a functional building of any kind. But it still is a sort of place that you can visit. So it definitely is, it's a place. It's a world that you can go into, but it evokes the past. And I think that, that the proximity, I would say, between ancient Roman culture and ancient Greek culture seems to also, in my mind, place these two buildings somehow on a par. That there's some potential, meaning to the structures being shared. The fact that we have two different sets of ancient kind of Greco-Roman buildings, specifically Roman and then Greco, that are decrepit, old, in some sense ceremonial. Maybe, a Colosseum, a temple, a place where certain events and rituals are to be performed. Yeah, something along those lines, you could say.
There is a notion then of collapse, so to speak, because the structures we're studying are collapsing in some way. The the Roman structure and the Greek structure, both of them are buildings that are collapsing in a sense.
Okay, so what other things could we say about this whole situation? We got these two buildings, and one of them sort of represents water. Atlantis is sunk under the water, and the other one, Hailfire Peak's Fireside Coliseum kind of area, is on the fire side. So it has been burnt, or at least it is consumed by fire. It is surrounded by fire. So fire we may associate to one side, to the Colosseum side, and the Colosseum side is round, a round, derelict kind of building. You could say maybe that it, tentatively, you could say that maybe it is derelict because kind of the situation, atmospherically, in terms of ambience, the world of fire that it is in, and you could say then that what has caused its collapse, maybe you can see columns on the fire in this in this game. You can see columns resting in the fire kind of thing. Water is what has consumed the world of Atlantis, you could think. The world of Atlantis has been sunk into the water, so that water, in this case, is the element that maybe has played a role in sinking that world, in making its columns and its structures collapse and not be used anymore. In a sense, they are used anymore, right? There's fish floating around there. There's a few stray kind of pirate enemies among the ruins, and you are there as well. So it is being used, but it's sunk. It's underwater. It isn't in the state that one would imagine it might have been in the past. We might imagine that it once was a glorious city that stood somewhere outside of the water, but now it is in the water, kind of thing. Okay, so we've got fire on the fire side. So, another thing we could say about this is that there seems to be a certain kind of war and peace duality going on between these two places that I'd like to analyze. The way I see it is that Atlantis, or let's look at the fiery place, Hailfire Peak's Fireside, has a kind of how would you call it? There is, well, one thing we can say for sure is there is competition, because the Colosseum, the imagery of the Colosseum in ancient Rome, as far as I know, is a place where you would kill one another. So within the Colosseum, people would fight, kill one another. Maybe they didn't always kill. I don't know what happened inside the Colosseums. Maybe you also did other kinds of things. But the image we get through, media like Hollywood movies of Roman stuff is that, and this is anyway, this is maybe a tangent, but I imagine this is the common kind of influence that's influencing this game in a sense, is more cinematic images of these worlds, not so much rigidly sort of historically accurate depictions of these worlds. But anyway, that's just my interpretation. Also based around the idea that some of the music in this game, in Banjo-Kazooie, seems, in my mind, to evoke kind of like classic Hollywood soundtracks of different kinds. Anyway, getting rid of all that, the Colosseum is commonly thought of as a place where you fight, and maybe you fight to the death inside. So death happens inside of the Colosseum. Inside the Colosseum, death happens. In this game, death doesn't happen. You get a kickball tournament, which is a slightly jovial, serious, but not lethal game of ball throwing. It's competitive, but there is no death involved. But still, we are evoking, I think, the idea of death and struggle inside of the Colosseum. And maybe this is a side note, but also the fire world, you got fireballs falling from the sky onto you from the volcano, or maybe, presumably maybe the dragons are shooting them at you or something. But there are balls of fire falling onto you. So there are places of great danger in this lava fire world. You could also fall into the lava and die. So I think maybe it's a personal interpretation, but I feel as if both the themes of competition and the danger of the lava and the fire evoke death in some way, in my mind. Whereas Atlantis has very peaceful kind of music. The music in Fireside, Hellfire Peaks, and Mayhem Temple kind of Colosseum are also slightly sort of rigidly dun 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 kind of music. They're sort of very, there's like a marching element to it, like an aggression sort of. Whereas Atlantis music is this very flowy, peaceful sort of music, that I think evokes peace, peacefulness, and the image of a temple. So Atlantis seems to mostly have temples, things that echo the idea of an ancient Greek temple. Some of them even are called temple. The Temple of the Fishes is one of them. We get religious imagery of different kinds, the water bearers of Aquarius or whatever, these sort of mermaids of legend. So there's images of folklore, legend, religion, spirituality, and temples. There are even bathhouses within Atlantis. So a bathhouse is also a place where you would rest and recuperate yourself, heal in some way. But I would like to argue that a temple is sort of a place of healing. It could evoke those ideas. You could have, sort of spiritual healing, connecting with God, with the divine, in whatever way, you can. So in any case, I think the ideas that are being evoked in Atlantis are ideas of life, healing, an evocation of peace, so to speak. And then, of course, all of this stuff, this peace, being evoked by water at some level. And water here, could be just as dangerous as fire. You can drown in water. A flood can ruin your life, your town. So water can be just as dangerous as fire. And fire can be great for health and for life. You can warm yourself, you can warm your food. So fire is just as life-promoting as water is. Water is just as death-promoting and dangerous as fire. But I just want to argue, for the purposes of this analysis at the moment, that in this game, the Atlantis world has an evocation of water equaling peace and life, a sort of peaceful spirit kind of thing that is life promoting and healing, like a sort of paradise of some kind. And then Hailfire Peaks would be sort of hellish, a hell world of fire, conflict, war, death, battle, struggle to the death, and all of that somehow being associated to fire. Perhaps being associated to fire, and interestingly enough also to circles, maybe, Hailfire Peak's Colosseum is a circle. The buildings in Atlantis are squares. And I see these as potentially two separate geometric shapes that are being contrasted here in this section of the game, at least. And maybe this has consequences later in the game, which is what I'm trying to study or think about in some way. I'm trying to think about whether these shapes have some relation to the rest of the game and what are the contrasts between these places. So anyway, to recap, an idea of war, fire, death, danger, circle, presumably, maybe, and both of them, of course, as worlds that have collapsed, worlds that used to be presumably structures, rigid structures that were lifted up from the ground, that rested, tightly kind of on themselves, that now, for different geographic kind of ambiental reasons, like water, fire, and so on, have crumbled, maybe even plainly the passage of time, right? Because these are evocations of ancient, distant worlds, distant Rome in the past, and so on. And of course, ancient Greece as well. So the past, something that was once alive and rigid, structured, sort of held onto itself, had a backbone kind of thing, a structure to it. And this, through the passage of time or whatever other means, has collapsed, crumbled away. The columns have fallen, the bits of building blocks have fallen off, and the structured stuff has collapsed and fallen down. So I think, that's another thing I think that's being evoked here. So I think I've spoken almost too much about this, but I feel like there's still something to be said about it quickly. See if I can get at it. We have this idea then of fire on the one side as being destructive. Life affirming, but not perhaps in the sense of promoting life, but maybe in the sense of promoting your life in contrast with someone else's. So a conflict, a war, in which you're warring in order to protect yourself and maybe assert dominance over a rival, perhaps. So maybe there's also that aspect to it, a conflict in that sense. In the Colosseum, you're fighting for yourself to survive in your own way, right? You're fighting against others. So there's a sort of an assertion principle maybe being explained or explored there in some way. Hello. Okay, so what were we talking about? I think we were talking about how death seems to be central to the fireside, and this aspect of conflict then may exist in contrast to Atlantis, where perhaps less of a conflict between you and another person could exist, and more sense of, what are you doing in Atlantis? You're visiting the temple, right? One of the buildings there that you could visit is a temple. You could argue that most of the buildings in Atlantis are modeled on Greek temples, so that even if in game they're not temples, they could be modeled off temples in ancient Greece, I think. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I don't have enough knowledge of what a Greek temple is in order to say whether they are or aren't. So let's leave that for now. But let's just say there is a temple, at least, and it is quite a central kind of building, if I remember correctly. So you enter the temple. Entering the temple is a place you can go in Atlantis. You can also go to the bathhouses. I think you can go to the bathhouses in Atlantis. So those are at least two places you can go. So there is a sense almost of, I'm tempted to say that there is a sense of like, letting go kind of thing. You go to the bathhouse to relax, and a sort of a relaxation of the body, and maybe kind of the temples themselves may also be a place of vulnerability where you let go of yourself into the divine, so to speak, right? So we may have some notion of surrender, maybe, happening in this water section. There is this peaceful ambience, right? The music's peaceful. It sort of evokes a peaceful kind of world, Atlantis, a forgotten paradise of peace. And so it could evoke peace in this sense of letting go, right? There is no conflict between you and another. Almost you could say, if you want to go into cliches around this issue, a sense of a union, right? A union with the other. In that maybe, you can have a union with the divine, whatever divine it may be, in the temple, right? A temple may be seen as a place of union between two things, bridging a separation, so to speak, between you and God, to put it that way. And then, of course, contrasting it again to the Colosseum, which might be a place of contrast between you and another, Okay, so we spoke a little bit of religion in the sense that the temples, in the Temple of the Fishes and in Atlantis, give to me the feeling of a temple, a Greek temple, and therefore a place of religion, or at least of spiritual practice. And I wanted to connect this a little bit, perhaps, with Jiggy Wiggy's temple. Jiggy Wiggy's temple is, I think it's called Jiggy Wiggy's temple. It is a temple in this game where one meets the god, the great god, Jiggy Wiggy, I think. Right, the name fails me a little bit, but there's some sort of great force is invoked there, right? A great god that has something to do with Jiggies and therefore with like image completion in some sense. Hey, hello. Okay, so we're talking about religion. And I thought something we could say about religion is there is institutional religion, right? There is a religion that's big, has like a structure, like a foundation, and maybe even like a strong history to it with hierarchies of power and things like that. I'm not sure really if that's the correct way of about it, but what I mean is that there seems to be in Jiggy Wiggy's temple a sort of duality, I feel, between like an institutional religion as we know it and influenced by Christianity, I would say, because Jiggy Wiggy's disciples outside of the temple, they guard the temple, right? So the disciples stay outside and they wear these brown, like sackcloth robes that look a lot like, I don't know, Franciscan monks or something. It has like a Christian feel to it. So they are Jiggy Wiggy disciples, they have big golden G's as a head, but they seem to be dressed as Christian monks of a certain kind, and we suppose they are lower to the higher monk, Jiggy Wiggy himself. In fact, Jiggy Wiggy is Master Jiggy Wiggy. Okay, so we have these sort of apparatus in place. But Jiggy Wiggy is also some sort of a magician, I would say. He's controlling the powers of Jiggy Wiggy. We're not really sure what these powers are, but he seems to control them, or at least execute them. He invokes them, in a sense. And so we don't get a strong sense of any other power than his own. He is the power there who controls these strange forces, right? Master Jiggy Wiggy is the one of these forces. And that's definitely, that's different from how, that's not really how I would define a typical, like, institutional version of Christianity, at least, right? Because there isn't so much a sense of a priest. Jiggy Wiggy isn't so much a priest who's controlling the sermon and the mass and the rites and the texts, or reading the text and so on. It feels more like there isn't so much a higher being that Jiggy is controlling or in relationship with. It seems more that Jiggy Wiggy himself has a certain kind of power. Now, this power does admittedly come from something called the crystal Jiggy, which is at the center of that room. And the crystal Jiggy shines forth and sends a beam up into the sky. That's okay, right? Okay, hello. I wanted to say also that the point of me mentioning this is mostly to tie it back to the idea of Atlantis being a temple, right? And therefore a temple in the sense of a religious figure, a religious place of some kind or another. And the institutional aspect of religion, in the sense, I mean, of something that lasts generations and has structures that survive, and maybe even specifically a multitude of people, like disciples, head monks, and so on, makes me sort of think of these big grand buildings we see in Atlantis. Buildings, big temples that require a lot of people to build them, and it sort of implies a lot of people living together for a long time, performing the same actions for a time in a certain sense. And that aspect of it, the way that potentially connects to Jiggy Wiggy's temple as also being a big, grand temple, and so on, these kind of issues. And in some sense, I think this is contrasted with an idea of shamanism that is more personal. You're the shaman. You maybe live outside of the woods or in the village, or like the idea of witchcraft, right? Like Gruntilda being a witch. The idea of the witch who lives outside of the village, far away, in an offshore sort of place, not offshore, like off, away sort of place. And of course, whether these traditions are real or not isn't exactly my concern, or it is partly my concern. I mean that we have here a certain depiction of the idea of witchcraft. Witchcraft in reality may have been something different. Shamanism in reality may be something different as well. But I think that we have a depiction of the lone witch, who does all of their work alone. They don't need a whole series of buildings and institutions to support that work. Mumbo Jumbo can do his work on his own. He's got his magical sort of, touches and instruments that he can do, and he can do them. He doesn't necessarily need other stuff around it to support him, right? In the game, I would say, because again, shamanism in reality is probably something more complicated. It involves a lot more ties to the town and a lot, maybe actual discipleship roles, actual, transmission of knowledge, which would be some sort of a tradition that is carried down through time, and therefore you could say that it's institutional in that sense. It's an institution that is carried on through time and involves multiple people and so on. So again, maybe the particulars of how shamanism works in reality are not so much the issue here as maybe the archetype of the hermit, the lone person who does magic on their own terms, away from the town, kind of thing. That's an archetype in here, and I think has some sort of relevance to these other ideas of grandness, bigness, big buildings, big institution, big sort of structure of different kinds being held out through time, through written means, building means, whatever ways possible, possibly also, again, these structures of power amongst disciple and leader, maybe the leader having power not just on the disciples but other people in the town, some sort of power over them in some sense, political power to decide what's happening in the town and so on. So an active role in the civilization, so to speak, in the creation of the culture, and not so much this like lone, isolated idea of the witchcraft, somehow away from the town, doesn't really looked at, doesn't want people to come and bother them or ask them for help. In fact, if you ask them for help, you do it at your own risk, potentially. And they just want to live away and alone from all of the, argy-bargy of life in the city, sort of thing. That idea, regardless of how real that is historically or what the real historical realities of it are, so to speak, is important or interesting in this game. I think there is a contrast between these two traditions in this game: the loner alchemist kind of tradition and the more religious priesthood lineage, civilization, institution tradition. I think. In fact, I think what's happening is that we've got this idea of the witch, Grunty, let's say, as someone who is in control directly of whatever magic or spiritual there is, right, to be harnessed. Like she is directly, or the witch is directly in contact with whatever is they're doing that involves the non-here kind of world, the non-here stuff. Whereas the idea of a traditional like Christianity institute sort of religion might involve more this sense of, and I think Jiggy Wiggy also evokes this general idea of monotheism, of there is some sort of great power, and I am a priest for that power, right? And however, Wiggy is also ultimately a shaman, it seems. Jiggy Wiggy is also ultimately directly controlling this magical power, directly directing it to different places. Even though the ideas of organized religion that it's evoking, I think, are the ideas of someone who wouldn't usually touch directly. Usually they wouldn't touch the power directly. It would be heretical to touch the power directly. You just sort of serve the power. You honor the power. You honor God. You serve God. Maybe you read texts about God. You perform rituals that connect you back to God in some way, but you don't belong to God in some direct way. You don't belong to that power. You don't harness it and use it in a direct way. Usually that would be the way that I see monotheistic Christianity working in this way, right? As a less hands-on kind of religion. Whereas Gruntilda, or the idea of a witch, is more hands-on. It's do stuff directly to control a certain kind of power that comes through a magical ways. So we've got these two types of characters, right? Let's say the idea of a priest and the idea of a shaman, or the idea, of a priest and the idea of a witch, as like, and sort of traditionally seen as okay or something. And something that happens between them, I think, is that one idea is the idea of kind of giving towards this higher power. You just give up. You go, there's sort of a spiritual power, a reverence, a letting go into submission or serving, right? Serving the higher power. There's something about serving and therefore uniting. You become one with it, but from the perspective of submission. You let go. You stop attaching anything, right, towards this higher power. That would be the idea of, like, let's say, priest, traditional priest in Christianity idea. Sort of monotheistic priest Christian idea. I don't know. That sort of thing. And then you got the idea of magician, taking affairs into their own hands, mixing the ingredients together, trying to achieve a specific effect out of their own free will. Like, I want this, so I will do it. I'm not towards this higher power. I'm not letting go in any way. I'm sort of deciding to do things a certain way. And maybe I'm even doing them against others. So maybe in the idea of the witch living away from the town, in the woods, hidden away from the town. So I'm not uniting with the townsfolk. I'm not uniting with the town. I'm not one with them. I'm separating from the town. I'm not necessarily friendly. I'm not necessarily happy to see people who visit me. I'm not necessarily happy to see people in general. There's a sort of hiding away from others and therefore creating your own desires. You're not meeting the desires of other people necessarily. You're doing things yourself. So a kind of a power taken into your own hands, not submission into power, but holding of power and using of power in contrast to other people, sort of thing. And so, of course, this idea ties in with the idea I was trying to discuss before about the Colosseum and the Temple of Atlantis. So the temple as a building of potentially union with something else, union with the divine, union and therefore submission or giving in to someone, maybe. And the Colosseum as a place of fighting, struggling against someone, and therefore exercising your own power and your own desires against other people's desires that may run counter to your own, or in any case having some sort of boundaries between yourself and others, and existing as something that is not uniting to others, but is uniting to yourself in some way, or existing as yourself as, separate from others in some way. Hello. Okay, sorry about the screen thing, always. So I wanted to talk a bit more about bigness, because we've been talking about this theme of perhaps civilization, the idea of what does it mean? I think for me it seems to simply mean scale, as in scale in space and time. And I think that a lot of these things probably scale about these axes of space and time. Okay. And by I mean something like it lasts a long time in space. So that, for example, the materials in which something is built are long-lasting and therefore require a lot of work to be put into it, a lot of labor, and therefore a lot of time. It's taken a lot of time to build it. It's required a lot of people, workforce, and these sorts of structures, therefore, are built in such a way that so a lot of people have been involved. Okay, so we were talking about bigness, and bigness requires a certain scale, a notion of scale, where you could have something that you consider big on one side, something that you don't consider big on the other, and some sort of scale between them. So it's a measure that you're measuring yourself, basically. But to measure this, I think what we want is to think, okay, what's a big culture? What would that even mean? And I think when we say things like that, a civilization, like a huge, I don't know, historical figure, a huge historical monument, or civilization, imperial kind of thing, and also what we call it, established, institutionalized, institutional, things like that. I think have to do with bigness in space, because the bigger it is in space, the more of a chance it has of being remembered, you could say. And of course, that connects with bigness in time, meaning for a long time, people have spoken of this tradition, let's say. People have spoken of this. People have practiced this, Okay, I want to work through this concept of bigness a little bit more. I think by bigness, I mostly mean it's remembered somehow. It's within our consciousness. So if it's within your consciousness, you remember it. And I think that things that are remembered a lot by a lot of people in a lot of places, are remembered because of a certain bigness. And archetypally, I mean, so a bigness, again, space and time, a bigness in those two fields. Okay, what do we mean by that? Well, again, a lot of people getting together to do one same task, whether they want to or not, right? So it seems like the issue here has something to do with like coordination. People, however, wouldn't get together to organize something so big unless there was some sort of what do you call it, like a decorum, is that the word, like organization, decorum, is that the word? Okay, now what I meant more was will. If you have the will to do something, or if you're, yeah, let's just start there. If you have the will to do something, if you have the will to do something, you can collaborate with others to do it, right? If you are, yeah, let's just leave it at that for the time being. So, if a lot of people get together and decide to do something, they can put a lot of work into it and time and produce something very durable. Even if it is like I don't know, a language or a tradition, something slightly more ethereal like that. When there's a lot of thought put into it in the sense of a lot of people, then something happens whereby the materials used to make that, or the time spent thinking about that, and all the time spent, let's say, circulating that idea, whatever it is, that structure, it allows the structure to grow and extend in many ways, right? Through space and time. However, the people involved in doing that don't necessarily need to agree that they're doing it, or, agree to like participate in some way. You could have a group of people who organize together to build something really big, and they will build something bigger that would last longer than a smaller group of people who are also building something big, right? Not always. There may be a certain type of resourcefulness that a smaller group of people can use to develop something really big. But I would imagine that when there's a lot of people involved, at least that's just my idea right now, when there's a lot of people involved, the thing can not only be made big, but sort of be made sort of to be maintained, or be maintained through time and extended and kept. And also the work put into the materials, or the design, or the devising of whatever it is you're devising, you can spend a lot more time on that. There's a lot more work capable to be put on that when you have a big group of people to do it, sort of thing, so to speak. So we have some sort of a duality between wanting to participate or not wanting to participate. Wanting to participate, meaning you're sort of willingly collaborating with the group to build whatever the group is building, whatever it is, right? You're doing that. Let's. And then you have like the witch who lives away from the group and doesn't willingly want to participate in whatever the group is building. So yeah, that's sort of an idea. It's as if then maybe when we're talking about these big structures that last long enough that they can last through time until they collapse, and then once collapsed, leave sort of remnants of themselves, or they can be seen through time uh, because of how many people were involved in making it. Again, willing or unwilling, the group of people. In that case, then, we have a group of people where a debate opens between whether you wanted to participate or not, so to speak. Okay, so we're left with this question then, I suppose, between wanting to do something and not wanting to do something, and the potential outcomes of that. So if a lot of people want to do the same thing, they can do it and suddenly it's really big. If a lot of people don't want to do the same thing, but, they do it anyway, then they're also doing something that's really big. In both cases, we can make something really big. And uh, and what else? What else can we say about that? Well, in both cases, then also you could. Okay, where is this relevant for Banjo Tooie? Let's just stay there for a second. Where is this relevant for Banjo Tooie? We've got these structures. In this case, I am specifically speaking about Atlantis, the ruins of Atlantis in the game, that are a big ruin of some sort of big group of people who decided to collaborate on something big. And again, by decided, I mean maybe the people who collaborated on it didn't want to collaborate it, like the workers particularly probably didn't want to build the buildings, or maybe they did, we don't know. But it might have been, let's say, a mix or sort of a group of people who wanted to do something and a group of people who didn't want to do it. Okay, something like that. And something really big was built that lasted. It made an impression in space and time. We can still see it, right? The ruins of that world are still there in Banjo-Tooie, let's say. And let's go back a second to this issue of will, because I think also central to this at some level is like, I don't know how you would call it, that if you can sort of, there's like an accumulation of resources that happens in this way, because if you're building something really big, you might need a lot of different resources, a lot of different stones, precious stones, and metals or glass, whatever it is. You'll need a lot of stuff, and you need to gather all this stuff and put it together. And then it's as if to build something that big and accumulate something that big, something big in those terms, as in the terms we're talking about, whatever they are, those big things need to be built in this way where the more, I would argue, the more resources needed to build it, like the more work is going to have to be done. You're going to need more workers basically working on it. to me, that seems to speak, therefore, some sort of a unification of will. Again, wanting or not wanting. Like, you can be collaborating in a big project as a worker without wanting to be a worker for this project, but you can be collaborating anyway, so that you are a part of this big project that has like a unified objective in terms of building a specific thing. It's not a big group of individual people, each building their little thing. There seems to be, for these kind of, the bigger materially, the bigger the project is, it seems like you need more workers to work on it, and therefore those workers will need to work together in some way, collaboratively, again, whether they want to or not, so to speak, like in the case of these sort of big projects. And, therefore, these kinds of big projects to me seem to suggest a sort of unification of a big group of people into one single kind of objective, so to speak. And this objective then has some material structure to it, where something is being built, even if it's, again, some sort of a very vague, ethereal, cultural thing. There is like time being put into devising the notation for it or something, or the language for it, or you got to meet with people and talk about how you're going to do things. So even if when it's ethereal sort of work, there is still some sort of work, some sort of physical work, let's say, potentially involved in it. Physical, I mean here more in the sense that it's happening, again, shared, let's say. So it's not just, it happens in close proximity with a sharing that you're having with other people, let's say. Let's try and connect this back to Banjo-Tooie in some way. I am focusing on Banjo-Tooie at the moment. I think some of this applies to Banjo-Kazooie as well in general. But so we're talking about a witch at some level, right? At some level. It is a game about a witch who attacks other people and is punished. Okay. And a witch who works alone for the most part. I mean, okay. Yeah. Maybe for the moment, let's ignore that Grunty doesn't work alone. She does collaborate, right, with people. She collaborates with several people throughout the games. But she also has her own kind of plans, let's say. And her own plans have some, that have some sort of meaning to them that's devised, let's say, without consulting others, maybe. I don't know if that's the best way to put it. But she can concoct a potion, right, in her bowl, where the potion will be 100% her own sort of potion. She decides what ingredients go in and whatnot, right? She can decide what the potion is, and also devise some sort of magical kind of plan that devises only within her, if that makes sense. Okay, I don't know. To be a little bit more coherent, because I'm trying to be too sort of poetical and it doesn't quite work. Okay, let's see if we can go there. Witches have archetypally this idea that they work alone, that they have their own little cabin in the woods, in fairy tales, I mean, right? And in that cabin in the woods, they devise their own plans and they build their own things and they have their own sort of power that only they have, and only they can connect with that power. It involves only them, because they are the only ones who know how to make the specific potion or how to devise a specific plan and get all that magical power out of that plan and so on, and do magical things on their own terms. And so I think that they are not very collaborative by nature in the archetypal domain, so that, you know, there is well, let's leave it at that for the time being, right? There is an archetypal idea of a witch as someone who is slightly like a hermit, who lives alone, kind of isolated, doesn't really belong to the community, and has plans of their own and ways of doing things of their own, maybe tastes as well of their own that are not maybe shared by the community, that might be taboo for the community, desires that might be taboo for the community, right, that sort of stuff. So there is a feeling of being an outcast, I think, with the witch, a feeling of not really belonging to the tribe, let's say. And I think that this certainly is present in Gruntilda. In Banjo and Kazooie, she is very clearly bullied, we are told, has been bullied all her life by almost everyone. We get anecdotes from her sister that suggest that teachers were bullying her, classmates were bullying her, her parents, her family, friends, if they existed, were also bullying her. Practically everyone, strangers, were bullying her. There is a sense that being bullied was very, it happened a lot, kind of thing, and it was a big part of her life growing up. That's the sense we get, and a sense also that she had, again, that she sort of did things that other people found taboo or wanted, desired things in ways that other people found inappropriate as well. So that there's an inappropriateness for the group. She's outcast because she doesn't belong. She doesn't belong to the group. She is perceived perhaps as being too individual in a sense. Her desires are very unique. They're not shared with others. She can't go up to another person and be like, oh yeah, I share this taste with you. I share this desire with you. There's a very little sense of that. There's a sense that she grew up in a community where she didn't belong in any way in terms of desires and in terms of her unique personality, let's say. Her desires, her thoughts, maybe, her plans for the world. I don't know. That's the thoughts I have in my head, at least when I think of the way Gruntilda is spoken of in the first game, that she has a great sort of uniqueness that wasn't accepted. Something very unique literally in the sense of it wasn't shared by others, you know what I mean? It literally belonged only to her. As long as she could see it. Like, maybe other people just weren't sharing their desires and she was kind of, scapegoated, or the only person who visibly shared her unique way of being with others. And that, that's going into the mechanics of how bullying works. I'm not necessarily interested in going into that at the moment, but just this fact of uniqueness as being different from the tribe, and therefore having different uniqueness, different unique goals from the goals of the tribe. The tribe is different from her. She wants something that the tribe doesn't want. And so she exists potentially. I'm reading into this. This isn't really stated a lot by the game, but I assume that the archetype of the witch in fairy tales tends to go along these paths of they live alone and away from the town. And in the context of Gruntilda, that seems to make sense as being someone who is told to have suffered a lot of bullying, so that, now she lives alone and far away. She doesn't necessarily want to belong to any of the groups that she's around. But yeah, we have to look deeper into that, because of course she at the same time does make a big attempt at that, and being like pretty in a group minded way and being accepted. Anyway, I'm going off the rails now. Yeah, just wanted to end that thought in terms of mainly with speaking here of uniqueness versus non-uniqueness, which would be shared goals, shared ideas, shared existence, sharing in general, and meeting goals together kind of thing. So that idea of a group collaborating to do something, or in some way even a group having a togetherness where almost all the members of the group have the same way of existing, or a shared collaborative, language, way of expressing themselves, traditions, things that are passed down from generation to generation, ways of being, thoughts, ideas, desires. I'm repeating myself, stuff like that, right? And the way that, in a sense, I think lasts. That's my argument. It may be not true. That those kind of things shared last longer in space and time, because again, unwilling people, willing people, even if you are like Gruntilda, so to speak, imagine you're in their group, but you're collaborating with it, even though you don't want to in some way, just by being with it. In that case, the amount of things that are going to last and are going to be shared across time are really big. They're going to last for a long time and be shared by a lot of people, and therefore maybe even be shared through a lot of different places, because people might move from here to here, and then there's an expansion in that way. So there is also here, of course, the notion of like colonialism and expanding towards someone else with, with a sort of acquiring kind of mentality. I'm going to acquire stuff and I'm going to keep it, and it's destructively kind of thing, right? Like you're gonna destroy what's happening somewhere so that you can keep it in your own way, so to speak. That's a way of describing it, maybe. But yeah.
So we had some themes of war and peace, perhaps, appear in the previous section, in which I had a lot of audio difficulties and technicalities. So I'm going to switch to microphone and see what happens. I hope this goes better than previously. So, yeah, anyway, we're talking about war and peace at a certain level.
and war having something to do with disagreement, perhaps. Okay, where could we go from here? Well, King Jingling says that there is an important tournament that's going to happen between the Jinjos and the Moles. It is a tournament that will decide whether there will be trouble between the Moles and the Jinjos or not. This trouble is decided mostly because King Jingling says that there is a long history of, difficulty between the Moles and the Jinjos. And because of this, if this competitiveness doesn't happen, if the game doesn't happen, there could be trouble. Those are his words. I assume what he means by that is there is a big competition coming up. There's a great rivalry between these two peoples. And the whole idea is, well, if this rivalry somehow doesn't get executed, if the execution of this game doesn't happen, then the rivalry might turn sour. That's how I interpreted his words. I suppose they are also a kind of a joke about the kind of violence that happens outside sports stadiums, like football stadiums and so on, between the fans of different football teams, where there can be altercations between those fans when something goes wrong in the game or something, when someone thinks that the other team did something wrong or something. I assume it's a reference to that. But in this case, the King Jingling, is sort of deciding that it is very important for the people of his kingdom to participate in this game. It's almost like an issue of national security or something. Okay, and I think I could probably also bring into the picture this final scene in the game, in Banjo-Tooie, where all of the characters are having like an argument. An argument is springing amongst them. Banjo, Mumbo, Humbawamba, Kazooie, I think Bottles' his brother, Jam Jars as well. They're all having a big argument. I'm not sure even what it is. Just some growing tension between them, and they start attacking each other with personal kind of attacks, like, you're stupid, your magic is stupid, no, your magic is stupid, your way of doing things is bad, your way of doing things is bad, and they have all these personal attacks towards one another, which, clearly weren't sort of the reason that the tension was emerging. There was some reason that tension was emerging, but that was kind of hidden to them, I think. Okay, so we got this scene at the end, right? And when they argue like this, they then dissolve this argument by going up into the terrace of whatever building they're in. Well, no, actually, they are not in... They're in Bottles' house, arguing. And they decide to go and play a game. Because by playing a game, they decide to go to the top of Gruntilda's lair, basically. And at the top of Gruntilda's lair, the very top of this lair, in the rooftop, so to speak, they do something to dissolve, like, the frustration, is the sense I get. The game they play is a game of kicking a ball. They kick a ball, and this ball is Gruntilda's head, her dead head, her severed head that has been cut off through, I think, the explosion at the end of the game, I suppose, when her whole body explodes in in the machine she's in. She's in a machine that explodes. This explosion within the machine, I imagine, if I'm remembering correctly, is what causes her head to just become disentangled from her body. Her whole body must, I suppose, collapse into pieces. And they use one of these pieces, the round bit that is the head, to kick it up into the air and play a game of kickball. Not kickball really, but they are kicking the ball and passing it from one member of the circle to another in a game-like formation, having fun playing with this severed head, throwing it from one person to the other. And this game seems to really relax the tension that they'd been in. And that tension could have exploded into something way worse. Presumably, it could have really strangled their friendships and become a lot worse than it had, but it doesn't, because they are playing this game of kicking a ball up into the air, and this game seems to unite them in a certain way or dissolve the tensions that they'd been experiencing. Something along these lines seems to happen in this scene. And this scene then shows some sort of similarity, I think, to what King Jingling is speaking about, albeit in a different context. King Jingling is speaking about some contest that's going to happen between Jinjos and Moles that is going to dissipate, we assume, some tension between them. However, at the end of the game, this dissipation of tension happens, but with different characters, not the Jinjos and the Moles. That contest we never hear anything about, I think. There may be some incidental mention of it at some point later in the game, I'm not sure. But it is certainly not the ending sequence. The ending sequence is our heroes, not the Jinjos and the Moles, but everyone involved in solving the riddle of this game, dissolving a potential frustration by engaging in an activity that's sort of competitive in nature and therefore violent in a certain way, but not violent against themselves. It's violence, in this case, directed towards Grunty's head. I think one thing we can say from all this, maybe, is that there seems to be a mix between game and war, or at least between struggle, conflict between people, and that struggle being transformed, maybe, and maybe the transforming element being a game. At least there's that feeling of a struggle that could have ended up in a war being transformed into a struggle that is competitive in nature, but by being a game or game-like in some way. Given all of these different situations, though, we could say then that game is something that seems to be fun. When you play a game, there's something fun about it. And maybe the essence of game is something that you do in union with others. I mean, when speaking of a multiplayer collaborative game like football, like kickball, like these kind of things, these kinds of games or sports where you're collaborating with others, board games as well, I don't know, role-playing games, games like, I don't know, hide and seek isn't a good example, but, games of that kind, like games you would play in childhood with other people, and that involve you and other people getting together to figure things out, move your bodies in certain orders and in certain ways, to get the ball to be kicked into a specific position and so on. These kind of games require collaboration, and therefore sort of union with the other person. There is therefore maybe a sense in which game could equate to union, and the struggle that the game is substituting in these situations a sort of a what would you call it? A destruction of the structure between friends, like friends becoming destroyed from one another. And again, friends becoming destroyed from one another can take many. It doesn't necessarily have to be good or bad. It can have a good side, like friends being really sort of honest to one another in a way that involves a certain degree of tension and maybe a tension in the relationship, but which then resolves into a greater kind of ability to communicate and understand one another in the future. So tensions and tensions between friends of these kinds don't need to devolve into a bad thing, and union and peace amongst friends doesn't necessarily have to be a good thing either. We saw in the case of Grunty and her bullying in childhood, right, that if you are to be a part of a community in which you are being stifled and repressed and put down all the time, if you're in peace with that community, if there is in some sense a perfect union between people in ways that squashes certain interior drives, to call it that, then that peace is in itself also violent in a certain way, or a war, or not entirely positive, to put it that way. So in these two examples then, war and peace in these contexts, there could be a positive side to struggle and conflict and tension between people if it is a greater communication between people in a certain sense, and there can be a war in peace or a struggle in peace if it's less communication, people being repressed, people being put into peace precisely because of a lack of communication or a lack of relationship between two different people. Relationship doesn't exist because you're just treating the other person as an object, as something to just be repressed or treated as little doll, as a human being that doesn't really exist in any capacity as a human being, the way someone who's being bullied or grunty might be treated, right? Someone who you're not actually having a relationship with them in any way because you don't know them, because there's no communication between you and them. Because if Grunty were to actually communicate and show who she is inside and what she's feeling, that immediately creates a struggle between them. The peace is only served or maintained as long as that communication doesn't actually exist, and therefore people are not actually getting to know one another. No relationship is being created between the two members of that relationship, to whatever the number may be, right? As an example. So where could we go from there? We've spoken a bit about peace and about war and about maybe what these concepts mean. And I was speaking now about how relationships between the characters in this game have a lot to do with them seeing each other, seeing one another sort of truly for who they are, so that things that are hidden underneath don't get hidden away. If those things upon coming up are a little bit of tension or a little bit of conflict, then so be it, right? In the name of making the relationship better, so to speak. And if the things that come out are peace and a great sort of a harmony with living with someone that maybe before you weren't in such harmony with, then great. Again, like another thing that makes the relationship better. And in both cases, maybe there is this issue, therefore, of seeing or perceiving the other person clearly very clearly, and maybe letting yourself also be perceived by the other person. And there is this mutual kind of perception, so to speak. So maybe there is an issue of mutual perception and seeing an image clearly. And I was thinking about how that could maybe connect to the theme of the jiggy, because the jiggy is a piece of an image. It's not the complete image. It's an image that you have seen only a bit of. You haven't perceived the whole image completely, so to speak. Okay, so perception and this having some connection to the jiggies, and therefore a puzzle that is completed piece by piece, and therefore, let's say, a perception that is completed piece by piece, something that you're not perceiving fully at the beginning, and then you slowly begin to perceive, and then you finally perceive. And the perception of that final jiggy completed image, so to speak, the images that the jiggy completes, then allow you to access some whole new place, right? That that you couldn't access before. So where we could go from there is maybe the image of a mirror, something I want to go to now, because Jiggy Wiggy's temple is very mirror-like, I find. The image of a crystal jiggy, and the floor itself of the temple, if you remember, is not, it's not crystal, it's not transparent, but it is reflective, very reflective of light. It's so reflective of light that it becomes a mirror, basically. It's a mirror. It only reflects light off it. And it reflects so much light that you can see stuff in the mirror. You see yourself, basically. You see yourself running down the hall of Jiggy Wiggy's temple. You're constantly seeing yourself in the mirror on the floor. And I would argue that a crystal jiggy itself is evoking also light, because light shines through it to open the gates into the worlds. So the worlds are opened in this game. The world in Banjo Tooie opened with light that comes out of a crystal jiggy. That's some sort of a mystical light as well, like a religious light of some kind, like a god that shoots out of the crystal jiggy like light. And this light opens a world that you couldn't see before. And a crystal jiggy, if you were to take it literally, is what is it? It's a jigsaw piece, right? The crystal jiggy is like a jigsaw piece in a puzzle. It's a jiggy, right? So it is a jiggy, but it's a jiggy whose image that it would complete would be a crystal image, if the jiggy were to ever complete an image, so to speak. Okay, so we're tackling this issue of transparency. I was saying how a jigsaw piece that is transparent would create a piece, an image, that is in itself transparent. And that idea, I'm not sure exactly what it means. What we can say is that the crystal jiggy lets light shine through it. So there seems to be an association being made, perhaps, between crystalness and light. The fact that the light can shine through the jiggy, or from one side of the jiggy to the other kind of thing, implies that this transparency lets light shine through it somehow. That's something about this transparency, like an aspect about this transparency. So, what else can we say about transparency? Well, one thing comes to my mind, which is that a mirror and a sheet of transparent glass seem like very different things to me. Maybe they're not that different. I'm not actually super sure how mirrors are made. They may just be like polished glass that's mega polished. I don't know, actually. Or polished metal. Anyway, ignorance. But transparent glass, like traditionally when you look through a sheet of transparent glass, that's not the same as looking into a mirror. Because in transparent glass, you're not seeing yourself in the same way that you see yourself in a mirror. However, I'm wanting to suggest that this whole idea of kind of light being reflected through a surface has a role in witchcraft in popular culture that I want to explore. In popular culture, I include, movies and fairy tales and things of the like. So, regardless of the historical qualities that this may have, we have, for example, a witch with a crystal ball. And we also have the idea of a witch with a mirror, a magical mirror. I think in Snow White, or in fairy tales of this kind, the witch has a magical mirror that reveals to her certain things that she wants to see, right? And you see things in these mirrors that are not what you would traditionally see. In the magical mirror that a witch looks into, you don't necessarily see yourself, you see the object of desire. You see something you want to see, something that you're asking to see. You ask the mirror, can I see this? And you see a certain thing in the mirror. So there is a request to see something, and the request is met through these mirrors. In the crystal ball as well, when I say tradition, I mean a crystal ball. If you looked at a crystal ball, a ball made of crystal, you wouldn't see anything inside. You would look right through it, in a sense, right? So it's neither a mirror nor anything that would reveal anything. However, in a crystal ball used in divination, or in the kind of practices that a witch would practice, you would see something in the crystal ball. So even though it's a transparent surface, that's kind of different from the mirror, right? In the mirror, you wouldn't expect to see something else other than your reflection. In the crystal ball, you wouldn't expect to see anything else other than, I don't know, the insides of whatever's on the other side of the crystal ball, and yet you do see something. You see something in the crystal ball. You see something in the mirror when you're a witch and you're using these things. So a witch sees in these things something different than what you would expect to see, given the physical qualities of these objects. And the physical qualities of these objects are that they reflect light in some way. Both of them have this quality of light reflection in some way. So it also kind of means that both of them deal with images. You're seeing something, but you're seeing something you don't expect to see. You don't know what you're going to see when you look into it. Precisely, there's a request. You ask the crystal ball to show you something, the same way that you would ask a tarot spread to show you something. You don't know what you're going to see in the tarot spread. You don't know what you're going to see in the crystal ball. You don't know what you're going to see in the magical mirror, because whatever it is that you see is sort of almost beyond your control. You're just requesting to see something, so to speak. So there's something about a crystal ball in this way that to me simply evokes seeing itself. I want to work around this idea. Light, and anything that reflects light, if you're not expecting to see anything particular in it, it almost seems like you could see anything in these mirrors and these crystal balls and so on, as if it's almost just the act of seeing itself, the act of visualizing something itself. So we brought up this topic of light, and I thought I might as well bring up the topic of sound as well, because in this game you also acquire sound somehow, right? You acquire sound through the musical notes that you're collecting throughout the game. And sound is something that somehow appears in this game quite a lot in the very name of the game, because the characters are Banjo and Kazooie, which are two musical instruments, right? And sound, yes, has to do with the names of the characters in this game, which makes me think that the characters themselves have something to do with sound. That sound is perhaps something very personal in this game, relating to the characters themselves, so to speak. And what is personal? What does personal mean here? Well, Banjo Kazooie, right? Banjo plays a banjo. In the intro sequence to the first game, he's seen playing a banjo. He's playing this banjo in the intro sequence. It shows him playing the music, so to speak. And playing music there means like expressing yourself. You almost get the sense that it's his character, so to speak, right? And so personal here, I think, means this personal character that the characters have when they play music. Yeah. Kazooie plays the kazoo, and that's like a distinctive way of her to express herself. Meaning, when she plays the kazoo, she's sort of wild. She's expressing herself in this really wild, kind of loud-mouthed sort of way. Yeah. And this way of expressing herself is sort of particular to her, you know. Playing the kazoo, as she does in the intro sequence, is loud, it's flashy, it makes like a noise and an impression, so to speak, that maybe other characters don't, you know. And her way of expressing herself is indeed kind of like her instrument in that sense. So personality, I think, maybe here expresses kind of how you express yourself, you know. Okay, so sound might have something to do with personality in this sense. And then personality, something private, yours, in that way. Okay, so sound is something personal, and personal means something you know. And therefore, sound may have something to do with you. So vision, how does that play in response to sound? It's not really clear what the law of this game is in regards to jiggies and musical notes. So it's not really clear what the role these entities play in the game is exactly. So the law not being that clear on what musical notes and jigsaw pieces are, I have to make some sort of a leeway conjecture, a conjecture on what's happening here. And my thoughts on what's happening here is that notes are round, so to speak. Round like dots on the stave, right? The musical notes are there, so to speak. There is some law that the game affords us, which is that jiggies in Banjo-Tooie are some sort of a supernatural entity, or they connect to God in some way, the spiritual world, right? They are portals that have something to do to some sort of a god of jiggies that's supernatural in some way, exists in some other realm that's not human, so to speak, and controls our human affairs in some way. Musical notes, on the other hand, have something to do, I would wager, with personalities, with your personal self, so to speak, who you are, right? Banjo plays the banjo, and that's what he does. And as I said, notes have this round appearance that exists on the lines of the musical paper, right? And jigsaws have like a square appearance. It's basically a square. However, jigsaws connect with round sort of slots on either side, right? And notes connect to other notes with rectangular sticks, so to speak. There are sticks, solid, straight lines that connect one note to another. Not strictly speaking, but let's say that visually speaking, it's a circle that that is connected to some straight kind of lines in some way, to create different types of notes, faster notes, slow notes, combination of a lot of notes, semiquavers, I don't know. And so, notes have something personal to them, I feel. You're your personal sort of self. You have your own instrument, you play your own instrument, and that's your voice, your way of speaking, in the intro sequence at the beginning of the first game, we see these sorts of behaviors, that each character has their own instrument. Tutti, for example, plays a flute, and when she appears in this sort of like angelical kind of way. It seems as if her flute denotes, a kind of sweetness, a high-pitchedness that maybe could culturally associate itself with the heights, something very elevated and I don't know, pure and sweet and something like that. So that, again, in that intro sequence in the first game, it almost seems as if each character's musical instrument has something to do with their personality. Kazooie is kind of like shocking and abrasive. The kazoo is kind of like an kind of instrument, and she is shocking as well in how she speaks. She shocks people with her insults and her very honest way of shocking them, of speaking to them. Banjo, I don't know. Banjo is probably just the name that they chose and it stuck. But I suppose that Banjo is also kind of there's perhaps something to his instrument that has something to do with him, but I can understand that it's a little more far-fetched as an interpretation. Tutti, I think, makes sense to interpret her instrument as having to do with her personality. The sweet sound of the flute in the intro sequence. It seems like she appears in the middle of the forest, and she's alone. Everyone's playing their instrument, and she suddenly appears and opens up like a space of mercy in the middle of the video, where suddenly everything's silent, and she's sort of speaking her little notes with the musical instrument that echo, I think, something of her personality, something kind of chirpy, so to speak, and there's I'm a sweetness, blah blah blah. These kinds of stereotypes, so to speak, that denote perhaps who she is or who she's supposed to be, or something about her personality. In any case, Mumbo, interestingly, is the only character who plays a whole series of instruments in that intro sequence. He plays the saxophone, the xylophone, the violin, and perhaps even another instrument. He sort of switches between instruments. And therefore, it almost seems like he doesn't have one instrument. He doesn't. Kazooie plays the kazoo, Banjo plays the banjo, Tutti plays the flute. They have their instrument that's just one and it's particular to them. That doesn't seem to be what happens with Mumbo. He has many instruments and he kind of plays them in his own ways, switches around. He does what he wants, basically. He just plays any instrument he wants. He seems to have like a free card for any instrument he wants. I think that's interesting because, of course, Mumbo can transform you, but presumably he can transform in general. He has the power of transformation into any shape that he wants. In the first game, right? He can transform you into different shapes. And there is this sort of like maybe lack of personality, or like a mask that presumably he's wearing. He does have, his head is kind of invisible. You don't know what his head looks like. So yeah, maybe there's something to that. And sound, therefore, I think has something to do with your personality, who you are, regardless of who the person is. And in the actual games, I find that interesting because the musical notes have different uses in the two games, but more or less I would say that it's the same use. Why? In the first game, musical notes open passageways within Grunty's lair. They take you to different places within the lair. Musical notes in the second game open passages to different areas of the island, of the Isle of Hags, but only because they grant you new abilities. So what the musical notes do is they buy you abilities, new skills. You can learn how to do the torpedo thing, or the high jumping thing, or the crouching thing. I don't know. You learn different skills. And each skill then allows you to access new areas of the island. It allows you to do a whole bunch of other things. So it's not a great argument in that sense. But I think that if we were to say, what do those skills allow you to do? I think you could say they allow you to get to places you couldn't get before. And some of those places are very general. They don't really allow you to get you to magical new worlds intrinsically, so to speak. Within each magical world, you can use your skills to move around in any way you want, in new ways. Every time you acquire a new skill, you can move in new ways around the different worlds, which is fine. But it's not those skills. The skills aren't what let you get in explicitly into the new worlds that you go to in this game, Oops. So sound seems to do something, which is that it lets you get to new places in the ordinary world, whatever world you're in. It allows you to move more freely within the world that you are. It allows you to move through the world in different ways. Can you jump? Can you run? Can you crouch? Can you get into a little hole? Can you destroy this kind of object? You suddenly find different things that you can do, your behaviors, so to speak. So sound may have something to do with your personality. your personal way of being, your behavior, how you behave. Does Grunty behave this way? Does Kazooie behave that way? How does Kazooie behave? How does she talk to other people, engage with the world? How does she, is her way of engaging with the world this way or that way? How does she engage with the situations she finds herself in? What if she's in an argument? What would she do? Would she apologize, or would she, not back down and engage in the fight, so to speak? What is her way of behaving? And not only that, but her way of behaving, you could say, making all sorts of jumps here, but you could say it's kind of like her move set. It's how she moves, how she behaves. So how you behave maybe has to do with how you move in the world, in whatever world you're in, so to speak. Whatever world you're in, that's how you move through it. And perhaps that has something to do with sound, with musical notes. So that musical notes maybe have something to do with personality, with self, with how you are. And self operates in this particular way, expresses itself in this particular way, behaves in this particular way, so to speak. What is vision then in these games? Vision seems to have to do with religion somehow. The religion of the Jiggy Wiggy, and the Jiggy Wiggy religion connects you with the skies, with something above, something that isn't human, so to speak, that isn't the self, perhaps. It isn't you. You are not that huge thing that lives in the sky. In fact, you've never met it. So let's maybe stay there for a second. What's your relationship with this big religious thing? It's not you, so to speak. It's not you in some particular way. You are not it. There's something different between you two. You know what I mean? So that the way that you are, your personal way of behaving, has something to do with how you are, and that enters into different worlds that you can go into. Your moveset can access the world in a very, terrain-driven way. You're accessing different worlds in your own way. You can jump, you can run, you can do things in the world that you can do, in your own way. Whereas the Jiggies open up worlds in like a magical sort of way, So the Jiggies maybe have something to do with something very, very different from who you are. It can do things magically that you couldn't, that it seems that you don't do, so to speak. It does things that it seems that you don't do, and it does them in a very different way. It's as if the Jiggies really do things that are different from how you are, perhaps. Different from how you are. You behave in a different way to how the Jiggies seem to behave. And what the Jiggies do is different from what you do. Yeah. Okay, not sure what we're talking about at this point anymore. Music, sound, visuals have something to do maybe then with the other, with something that's other, and that maybe it's something therefore you have no control over. It happens in its own way. It either happens or it doesn't, so to speak. You can control whether you collect jigsaws, of course, and how you place them and so on. But what happens once those jigsaws are placed is something beyond your control, something divine, so to speak. It happens through divine will, not through your will, through the will of an other, something wholly other, completely other from you, so to speak, right? And this wholly, completely other thing controls things that you couldn't control, right? It does things, it has behaviors that you don't have, so to speak. So the visual has to do something to do with the visual has something to do with, and it's not a very good argument, but my argument so far is that the visual has something to do with the other, and that therefore the self has to do with sound, and the self, therefore, so sound maybe is something that's expressing itself in this game, and the visual field may be something that you are receiving the expression from someone else. You're seeing, in a sense, someone else express itself, kind of thing. So that the visual field maybe has that character of something that you absorb, that's absorbed, and the self is something that's ejected outwards and sent outwards into the other, so that the other can see it. So the other can see what you are saying, in a sense. Sound is something that you're saying, and you're sending it towards the other. Yeah. Grunty is a head. Like the statue you walk into in the first game, the lair, is a head. So most of the first game happens inside of a structure that's shaped like a head, one could imagine. Or at least you could argue that if you walked in through the head, maybe you're later walking through the body, the rest of the body. You walk into different parts of the body. And in that case, you could say, well, you're inside Gruntilda's body for most of the first game, in some way, maybe symbolically, you could say that, perhaps. And so most of the first game, you're exploring a head. Let's say you're inside a head, and inside that head, you see all sorts of things, right? You explore all sorts of other worlds that you can access from inside of that head. You can enter into these paintings that are made of jigsaw pieces that take you to other places, maybe presumably outside of the head in some symbolic way, or maybe inside the head in the sense that they are simply other parts of Gruntilda's lair that can only be accessed through very specific doorways that have to be opened with the jiggies, with the jigsaw pieces. This head you enter through the mouth. So you could have entered the head through all sorts of other areas, parts of the head. You could have entered her through the eyes, for example, or through the nose or something, or through the ears. Right? You could have entered through all those different parts of the head, and instead you enter through the mouth. I'm interested in this because the mouth is somehow very important for Grunty. Her name means to grunt, right? Like to make some sort of noise with your mouth that maybe expresses a certain amount of pain. A grunt implies a certain amount of discomfort and pain, presumably, and maybe is an expression of discomfort and a slightly rough expression. So an expression that's very honestly kind of rough, that's not maybe hiding anything, like an honest expression, maybe you could say. And anyway, so a grunt comes out of her mouth. And other things that come out of her mouth, however, are rhymes. She uses language a lot out of her mouth. Stuff comes out in the form of rhymes that she uses to like trick you or taunt you, or basically any kind of dialogue that she says in the first game is in a rhymed form and exists there to taunt you, to guide you, to give you little tips, or to confuse you, or to hurt you, or to say anything at all. She communicates herself in this way, right? Presumably we could expect. So the voice, something coming out of the mouth, and you're inside the mouth of Grunty. And inside that mouth, you could say that Banjo and Kazooie enter, right? And who are Banjo and Kazooie? That's a question we could ask. Who are they? Okay, so Grunty's mouth opens. We got sounds coming in there, in a sense. We could say maybe that, Banjo and Kazooie are sound emitting things, instruments in some way. They're coming into her mouth, going into her mouth in that sense. And in her mouth, you find all sorts of stuff. One of the things you find is this big effigy of her that stands upright, kind of like this. It has hands outstretched and it is standing up. And it's an effigy of her inside of her lair, so to speak, that stands up like this, like a big statue of her. And inside of that big statue, there's like a little grid, like an opening into her stomach that's covered with like slants of wood or bars of wood, like a prison, And inside that little prison is, I think, something special. Something you want to collect. I can't remember. And you... a jiggy, for example, right? I think you can fall down her head and enter the stomach and find this special object. However, what I find interesting is that this effigy then, right, you can go inside that little chamber, so to speak. There's this chamber in her stomach that you can go into. It has these bars of wood, like a prison, that protect you there, that don't let you go out, so to speak. So getting in or getting out is difficult. It's protected by this measure of sorts that protects the entrance to this place that's inside of her stomach, that you can get into, that something special gets stored there, so to speak. Okay, so she's inside there. This brick place inside her stomach, bricked out as in, set apart from the rest of the body, is a place where you can go inside. Banjo and Kazooie can go inside. Anyone basically could go into this place that's inside the effigy. The effigy is big enough that you could place a person in there, so to speak, And reminds me a little bit of like the Wicker Man, or that sort of an idea. Those sorts of rituals where you place a big statue with a cage in the middle of it, and you can put a person in that cage and burn them. That sort of a ritual that I think exists in some pagan kind of cultures, I think, at least via pop culture and fairy tale. But I suppose it was done at some level, at some event, right? That there is these pagan rituals where you have stuff that you put inside of the stomach of a being that's a cage in themselves, a big effigy. burning then. Okay, so we spoke about burning inside of a place of some kind. That place can be constructed, or it can just be your body that is burning in itself. If we take the effigy of Gruntilda as a representation of her, then it's a representation of her burning, potentially. Even the statue of Grunty that is the entrance that we walk through into her lair, that big face, that statue of the face of Gruntilda, so to speak, has a mouth, the mouth you walk through into. That mouth has fire, what seems to be fire, inside of it. You can see the flashing light of like a cavern with fire somewhere, as if there were fire somewhere inside of it. And you can see from the outside of the lair at night in the ending sequence, Klungo is pushing the rock on the ground to try and get Grunty, who's under the rock, try to get the rock off her. And as the camera pans through them at night, you can see the face of that stone statue of her face, of Grunty's lair. Hope I'm not confusing you too much, but that lair has this fire, it seems, like a glow coming out of its mouth, so to speak. So perhaps it would seem that Grunty has fire inside of her, if you were to read these things in this particular way. That we have an effigy of her that seems like an effigy that reminds me of those sorts of pagan kind of, Wicker Man type of Burning Man type of people that you burn in different celebrations. Those celebrations celebrations and of course torches, presumably like ritual torches through burning. It reminds me of that kind of thing. So burning may be a theme. Burning of people within strange graves, prisons inscribed inside of other people, or just burning of the body itself, the fleshy body, just burning of that body. And burning in this sense, if we were to treat it in this way, could be something that's happening to Grunty, perhaps. Perhaps it's happening to Grunty at some level. And of course, symbolically, Grunty is a witch, and witches were burnt. So the burning of witches and the witch as someone who's burnt may be symbolically relevant to this game in some way. Okay, so burning. We're talking about burning. Burning happens with fire. Fire goes through your body. And it might go through Gruntilda's body in a sense of burning that might be happening to her in some way. So where could we go from there? Well, Grunty has eaten you, right? You've entered into her mouth. And inside her mouth, you live these kinds of crazy adventures. So you enter into that place and you play around inside that place, inside her mouth, so to speak, inside her body. So she has kind of like eaten you at a certain level. You've been eaten by her. And Banjo carries this little like pendant type thing, at least in the official artwork, and it might even be visible in the game. He carries this little pendant that is sort of a tooth, a white figure, sort of like the shape of a pear kind of thing, inverted, like an inverted pear, or, a tear, a white sort of inverted tear, that one would assume, I think, to be some sort of a fang from an animal or a tooth, and he's wearing that hanging from a pendant. And I have a feeling these kind of pendants where you wear a tooth hanging from them, in some cultures, and maybe I'm making this up completely, but it's a feeling I have. Let's say that it's just my personal feeling that if you wear a tooth on your neck, like a symbol that you're wearing, I wonder if that may not have something to do with having defeated that animal. And, you're kind of claiming that you have the remnants of the animal that you have survived, so to speak. You were devoured by an animal, or, let's say devoured at some level, attacked by an animal, devoured maybe in some way, and yet, symbolically devoured, yet you obtained this medallion that means, look, like, this is me having beaten that animal. I killed it, so to speak. I defeated it. I defeated that beast whose teeth, whose jaws, whose, fangs were about to eat me or attack me. And yet I have the fang here hanging from my pendant, meaning I have defeated it. I'm free from it. I haven't been attacked. I haven't been killed. I've survived the whole ordeal, so to speak. I have a feeling as if maybe his pendant could have something to do with that in terms of meaning, if you wanted to find some meaning in Banjo's pendant. And I have a feeling I've read cultures whose pendants have connotations of this kind, that this is something that exists in some folklores around the world, is a feeling I have. And so, if we say that you've been devoured by a beast, imagine you've been devoured by Grunty. You've been devoured by her. You've been eaten up, and yet, Banjo has this pendant that may symbolize defeating the attempt by a beast to eat me. Potentially a sea beast, let's say, like a huge sea animal that has tried to eat you, a huge fish or something, and that huge fish has tried to eat you, and yet you've defeated that whale or whatever, and defeated it, and here you are, still alive, and here you are, right? So maybe Grunty is such an experience for Banjo and Kazooie, some place that they go into through her mouth, being eaten by her. Okay, so what could we talk about? Talking about burning inside of someone. And Grunty kind of looks like an effigy in the sense that we have a statue of Grunty inside of the statue. Like her lair is a statue. She is a statue face. A face of a statue is Grunty's lair that you walk into. So you're inside a statue, you're sort of trapped inside of it, the way that you might be trapped inside that little effigy's stomach cage that I was talking about. And if that were your situation, then how would you get out? What do you need to do in order to get out, right? Okay, hello. So you're inside a beast of some kind, like a scary beast, and its teeth are eating you. You're inside Gruntilda, basically, inside that cave made of rock, right? She's made of rock. Okay, so when you're trapped inside this big statue, you can escape somehow, but you need to rescue your sister in order to do so.